Your son can sleep outside tonight. We cannot turn this lobby into a storm shelter for every walk-in. He's 8 years old, ma'am. I'm not asking for charity. Give him 10 dry minutes and we'll be gone." The rain struck the glass doors of the Bellwether Grand so hard that the city beyond them had disappeared. Inside, chandeliers burned above polished marble while the storm erased the city beyond the windows. The hotel still looked orderly enough to make bad weather seem like somebody else's problem. Daniel Brooks stood on the wrong side of that expectation. Water ran from Daniel's roofing jacket. 8-year-old Noah pressed against his hip, hands tucked under his arms, trying not to let his father see him shiver. Claire Mercer, the hotel's general manager, had already placed a folded towel on the marble between them, not as an act of kindness, but as a boundary. She was 42, immaculate even at midnight, with a navy suit that looked untouched by weather and a hotel badge pinned exactly level over her heart. "Your son can sleep outside tonight," she had said, quiet enough that only the nearest guests could hear. "We cannot turn this lobby into a storm shelter for every walk-in." Daniel had looked at Noah before answering. "He's 8 years old, ma'am. I'm not asking for charity. Give him 10 dry minutes and we'll be gone." Claire's jaw tightened. The hotel was sold out, 2 bridges were closed, and the ballroom held a delayed Medical Foundation dinner. Claire's regional vice president kept calling with one instruction disguised as many: protect the paying guests. Daniel knew none of that. Claire knew nothing about the $4.86 in his checking account. She did not know that the blanket Noah carried under his coat was the last dry thing they owned. She did not know that 47 minutes earlier, on a flooded service road 3 miles away, Daniel had stopped his truck for a stranger, even though stopping had cost him the last realistic chance of reaching the county shelter before it locked its doors. And she did not know that Noah had given that stranger something Daniel could not afford to replace. There were 3 knocks on the glass entrance. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 deliberate taps. Claire glanced past Daniel toward the doors. A figure stood under the stone awning outside, half hidden by the rain. An older woman, gray hair soaked against her face, a dark coat, no umbrella. Noah suddenly lifted his head. His fingers closed around Daniel's sleeve. "Dad." Daniel saw the boy's expression change. Recognition. Claire moved toward the entrance, irritated now, and the night porter reached for the lock. Daniel did not yet understand why the woman had come back. Claire did not understand why the chairman of the company that owned the Bellwether Grand had just walked through a storm to reach her own front door. And before that night was over, the hotel would have a problem far larger than an unwanted father and son in its lobby. A problem hidden above 600 people. A problem Daniel had already heard. 47 minutes earlier, his old pickup was crawling through water deep enough to hide the lane markings. The windshield wipers moved at full speed and still lost ground. Noah sat beside him beneath a faded red blanket that had belonged to his mother, Laura. Tiny white stars were stitched into one corner, and Noah rubbed one between 2 fingers whenever he was worried. "Is the shelter going to have cereal?" "Probably." "The good kind?" "The extremely expensive government kind." Noah smiled because he knew his father was lying for him. On the floor between them was everything that mattered for the next 24 hours. 1 backpack, 2 shirts, Noah's school inhaler pouch, a plastic bag holding birth certificates and insurance papers, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and Daniel's tool belt. They had left their apartment at 9:13 after water began leaking through the kitchen ceiling. Daniel, a roofer by trade, had known immediately that the building's flat roof drainage had failed. He had also known there was nothing he could do from the inside while lightning crossed the sky every few seconds. He had called the landlord. Voicemail. He had called the emergency maintenance number. Disconnected. So he had moved Noah away from the ceiling, packed the truck, and driven toward the county shelter at Jefferson Middle School. Then traffic stopped. A fallen tree blocked the main avenue. Daniel turned onto a service road he knew from roofing supply runs. Halfway down it, he saw hazard lights blinking through the rain. A silver sedan had slid nose first into a drainage ditch. Daniel slowed. The shelter doors closed at 11. The dashboard clock said 10:16. Noah looked from the stranded car to his father. Daniel kept driving for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was long enough for an old shame to wake up inside him. 3 years earlier, Laura had called twice while Daniel was on a storm job. He missed both calls. By the time he called back, she was in an ambulance with an aneurysm no one could have predicted or prevented. The doctors told him answering would not have saved her. Grief translated that into a different sentence. She called. You kept working. The sedan's hazard lights blinked again. Daniel stopped the truck. Stay buckled, he told Noah. He stepped into water up to his shins. The driver was an older woman, perhaps 70, trapped by a jammed door but unhurt. Her phone was dead, and the sedan leaned toward the flooded ditch. Daniel told her to cross the console. He braced the higher door while she climbed out, then guided her through shin-deep water to the pickup. Inside, Noah immediately pulled the red blanket from his lap. Here, the woman shook her head. You'll freeze. I'm already wet. You are not. I can be. Daniel glanced at his son. Noah had his mother's habit of deciding generosity before adults could complicate it. The older woman accepted half the blanket. Thank you, she said. Noah shrugged as if warmth were a small thing. Her name, she told them, was Helena Crow. She said she lived nearby. She did not say where. Her name was Helena Crow. She said a tow crew had been dispatched before her phone died and urged Daniel to take Noah somewhere dry. Daniel looked at the rising water around her sedan. We'll leave when I see the truck. You may lose your shelter place. He glanced at Noah, then back at her. It's just a place. Helena studied him, but did not argue. 22 minutes later, amber lights appeared at the end of the service road. A county tow truck came through the water slowly. Daniel helped the driver secure Helena's sedan, then returned to his pickup. The clock read 10:42. They reached Jefferson Middle School at 11:05. The doors were locked. A handwritten notice, sealed beneath clear tape, said capacity had been reached. Noah read it twice. Then he said, It's okay. Daniel hated those 2 words when they came from his son. Children were supposed to complain about unfairness. They were supposed to believe a father could fix locked doors. With the shelter closed and the storm worsening, Daniel drove downtown to the Bellwether Grand. He knew its stone portico from a job across the street. He did not intend to ask for a room. He only wanted Noah warm for a few minutes. At 11:17, Daniel pulled beneath the awning. The valet took one look at the rust on the pickup and stepped toward them cautiously. We're not checking in, Daniel said. My boy's cold. The valet looked at Noah. That was enough. He opened the glass door. For 7 minutes, no one objected. A clerk brought hot water, and Daniel stirred in the last cocoa packet from Noah's backpack. Then Claire Mercer came down after a security call. She saw wet boots, a work jacket, and a child warming himself near a vent. Pressure had reduced the lobby to categories for her: registered guests, staff, vendors, unauthorized persons. Sir, what room are you in? We're not guests. The shelter is full. I just need him warm. Claire explained that the hotel could not operate as an emergency shelter. Daniel asked for 10 minutes. She countered with 5. Her phone buzzed with another call from Victor Hale, the regional vice president who had spent the night warning her to protect guests, control access, and avoid business interruption. Daniel helped Noah back into his wet coat. Claire, exhausted and thinking in rules instead of faces, gave him the sentence about his son sleeping outside. Daniel's hand stopped on Noah's zipper. He did not repeat her words. He only said, He's 8. I'm not asking for a room. For 1 second, Claire looked ashamed. Then Policy 1. Thunder shook the windows. Above them, somewhere beyond the carved plaster ceiling, Daniel heard a low metallic pop. He looked up. No one else did. A second sound followed. Not thunder, not plumbing. A deep, flexing sound from steel under load. Daniel's eyes moved toward the ballroom wing. Then came the knock at the glass. 3 taps. Noah whispered, That's the lady. Daniel turned. Helena Crow stood outside. And for the first time that night, Claire Mercer looked afraid. Not because she knew who the soaked roofer was, because she knew exactly who the soaked woman was. Claire reached the door before the porter. She unlocked it herself. Mrs. Crow. Helena stepped inside, carrying 1 shoe in her hand. Her stockings were soaked black to the ankle. Her coat dripped on the marble. She looked less like the woman whose portrait hung in the hotel's private boardroom than an exhausted grandmother who had lost an argument with the weather. Claire's voice dropped. "We were told you were staying at your residence tonight." "I was?" Helena glanced past her. Noah was staring. She lifted the corner of the red blanket, still wrapped around her shoulders. "I changed my plans." Claire looked at the blanket, then at Daniel. The sequence assembled itself on her face. Helena walked to Noah first. "You left before I could return this." Noah touched the stitched white star. "You can keep it till you're warm." Helena's mouth tightened. There are moments when kindness embarrasses the person receiving it because it reveals exactly how much they have been given. "Your father has taught you dangerous habits," she said. Noah frowned. "What habits?" "Thinking other people matter." Daniel nearly smiled. Claire did not. She was already calculating another set of consequences. Helena Crow had founded the Bellwether Hospitality Group with her late husband 38 years earlier. She no longer managed daily operations, but she chaired the ownership trust, controlled the hotel property, and had a reputation for remembering employees who assumed she had forgotten them. Claire knew all of that. What she did not know was how much Helena had heard through the glass. "Mrs. Crow," Claire said carefully, "the city shelters are at capacity. We are also at capacity. I was managing access according to the emergency operations plan." Helena turned. "Does the emergency operations plan require children to sleep outside?" Claire's face changed color. Daniel looked down. He did not enjoy watching powerful people cornered. He had been cornered enough in his own life to know humiliation rarely improved anyone. "We weren't asking for a room," he said. Helena glanced at him. Claire seized on the correction. "Exactly. And I had offered 5 minutes in the lobby." Daniel met her eyes. After telling him he could sleep outside, a silence opened. Claire's phone buzzed again. She rejected the call. Then something strange happened. Instead of defending herself, she closed her eyes for half a second. Not long enough to look weak, long enough to look tired. When she opened them, her voice was lower. "I shouldn't have said that." Noah looked up at her. Claire crouched to his height, though the knees of her suit touched the wet marble. "I shouldn't have said that to you." Noah did not answer. Claire stood. "Room 614 is offline for a plumbing repair. The bed is clean. You can use it until morning." Daniel shook his head immediately. "We don't need, Dad," Noah said. "One word." Daniel stopped. His flaw had always looked like dignity from the outside. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was pride dressed in the same coat. He looked at Noah's shaking hands and understood which one it was tonight. "We'll take the room," he said. Helena said nothing, but she noticed. The elevator ride was silent except for rain striking the glass shaft. Claire walked them personally to the 6th floor. She moved quickly, checking messages as she went. The hotel was a different world above the lobby. Thick carpet, framed photographs of old city skylines, warm sconces, the faint smell of expensive soap. Noah left damp footprints until the carpet absorbed them. When they passed a service door near the ballroom wing, Daniel slowed. A brown crescent stained the wallpaper just below the ceiling. Claire noticed him looking. Old condensation. Daniel touched the wall with 2 fingers. It was cool, not wet. "How old?" Claire's patience tightened again. "We have engineers." Daniel removed his hand. "I asked how old." 2 weeks. Facilities inspected it. Daniel looked upward. The metallic pop from downstairs returned in his memory. A roof speaks differently when water sits on it. Every roofer who survives long enough learns that. Fasteners chatter. Decking complains. Drain pipes stop making the sounds they are supposed to make. But Daniel had no intention of becoming the wet stranger who told an upscale hotel how to maintain a 9-story building. He had done enough of that kind of saving. Room 614 had 1 king bed and a narrow sofa. Noah walked straight to the heater. Daniel turned it on and placed the boy's shoes beneath the vent. Claire stood in the doorway. "Housekeeping will bring dry towels." "Thank you," she hesitated. "If you need food, the kitchen can send something." Daniel looked at her. "I can pay for food." Claire's eyes went briefly to the work jacket, then away. "I didn't say you couldn't." The correction landed. Daniel recognized it for what it was, an attempt not to repeat the same mistake. "Soup would be good," he said. Claire nodded. As she turned to leave, Noah called after her. "Do you have kids?" Claire stopped. "One daughter." "How old?" 12. "Would you make her sleep outside?" Daniel closed his eyes. "Noah." Claire did not move for several seconds. Then she said, "No." Noah looked at the heater. "Okay." Claire left. Daniel waited until the door closed. That was rude. Noah's head snapped up. She was rude first. That doesn't make it yours to carry. She said I could sleep outside. I know. You weren't mad? Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. I was furious. You didn't look furious. That's because being furious and being useful are different jobs. Noah considered that. Then he asked the question Daniel had been avoiding since the shelter. Are we homeless? The word felt enormous in the warm room. Daniel leaned forward. No, our apartment got water in it. That's not the same thing. What if the landlord doesn't fix it? He will. What if he doesn't? Daniel looked at his son. He almost gave him another clean lie. Instead, he said, Then I figure out the next thing. Noah nodded as if that were enough. For now, it had to be. The food arrived 10 minutes later. Tomato soup, grilled cheese, and fruit charged to Helena. Daniel nearly refused it. Noah was too hungry for pride, so Daniel let the tray stay. After Noah fell asleep, Daniel checked his bank account, $4.86. A roofing payment was late, the truck needed brakes, and an old hospital balance from Laura's final night still followed him from one payment plan to another. For a minute, the free room felt like proof of failure. Then he looked at Noah's damp socks hanging by the heater and understood the difference. Failure would have been keeping his son cold to protect his own pride. At 12:08 a.m., a heavy thud sounded above the ceiling. Daniel stood. He walked into the hall. 2 hotel employees were moving buckets near the ballroom corridor. Water dripped from a recessed light. A facilities supervisor named Reed Mason was pointing at the ceiling. Roof drain backed up. We're handling it. Daniel watched the drip. It was not falling straight down. It moved sideways along the trim before dropping. That's traveling water, he said. Reed turned. Excuse me? The leak isn't above that light. Claire emerged from the stairwell carrying a radio. She saw Daniel. Mr. Brooks, you should be in your room. He nodded toward the ceiling. You need someone on the roof, Reed laughed once. During lightning? No, you need to clear the ballroom under it until the cell passes, then get a crew up. Reed looked at Claire. Who is this? A guest. Daniel almost corrected her. He didn't. Reed wiped rain from his forehead. We've got secondary drains. The membrane was serviced in May. Daniel looked toward the decorative windows at the end of the corridor. Rainwater sheeted across them. Your overflow scuppers are dry, Reed frowned. What? If the primary drains are backed up in rain like this, the overflow outlets should be running. Claire looked from one man to the other. Reed's expression became defensive. They're on the north side. Daniel pointed through the glass. That's north. The 3 of them looked. No water. Daniel heard it again. A low pop. Then another. Reed's face changed, just slightly. Claire saw it. Is that normal? Reed answered too quickly. Building movement. Daniel said nothing. Claire's radio crackled. Miss Mercer, ballroom wants an update. They have 183 attendees, and the foundation chair is threatening to move next year's event. There it was again. Arithmetic. Claire straightened. Keep buckets down. Close the east third of the ballroom. Move guests away from the leak. Daniel looked at her. Close the whole room. Claire's eyes sharpened. On what authority? None. Then let facilities do its job. Daniel's voice stayed even. Water weighs about 5 pounds per square foot for every inch sitting on a roof. If those drains aren't moving water, the roof doesn't care what your ballroom contract says. Reed stepped forward. We do not have inches of standing water. Daniel looked at the dry overflow opening through the window. Then show me where it's going. No one answered. Claire's radio crackled again. She turned away. Close the east third. Keep monitoring. Daniel watched her walk toward the ballroom. He felt anger rise. Not the useful kind. The old kind. The kind that wanted to prove he was right because being right felt like the only currency he had left. He took one step after her. Then Noah's voice came from behind him. Dad? Daniel turned. The boy stood barefoot in the doorway to 614. You said being mad and being useful are different jobs. Daniel stared at him. A slow, unwilling smile appeared. You were supposed to be asleep. I heard the boom. Daniel walked back. He knelt and put a hand on Noah's shoulder. You're right. About sleep? No. About me. He guided him inside. Before closing the door, Daniel looked once more at the hallway ceiling. The drip had become a thin stream. At 12:31, Claire stood just inside the ballroom, watching waiters move tables away from the leak. The medical foundation guests were irritated but calm. Reed told her the roof drains had passed inspection 6 weeks earlier. Her regional vice president texted, "Do not evacuate without fire/structural order. Document business interruption." Claire typed back, "Understood," then deleted it. She looked toward the ceiling. Another low, metallic sound rolled across the room. For the first time, she did not hear an inconvenience. She heard Daniel Brooks asking a simple question. If the drains were blocked, where was the water going? At 12:38, Claire knocked on room 614. Daniel opened the door halfway. Noah was asleep again. Claire kept her voice low. "I need you to show me what you're hearing." Daniel studied her. "What changed?" "I listened." That answer mattered more than he wanted it to. He stepped into the hall and quietly closed the door behind him. Reed was waiting 20 feet away with folded arms. Claire had also called Martin Say, the hotel's chief engineer, who had arrived from another property wearing rain pants over dress clothes. They stood beneath the corridor windows while Daniel explained. "The leak location doesn't matter much yet. Water travels. What matters is your roof isn't shedding it." Martin nodded slowly. "Primary drains could be obstructed." Reed shook his head. "They were cleaned." "When?" "Last month." "By who?" "Northline Exterior." Daniel looked at him. "Roofing contractor?" "Building maintenance vendor." That distinction sharpened something in Daniel's face. "What kind of roof?" Martin answered. "Modified bitumen over tapered insulation. Ballroom edition is 8,400 square feet." Daniel walked to the window and pressed his palm to the glass. "Any parapet overflow besides the north scuppers?" "2 east, 1 west." "Are they running?" Claire called security. Within 3 minutes, cameras showed the east facade. No water from the east overflows. Then west, nothing. Daniel exhaled. If all 3 overflow points are dry and the primary drains are backed up, somebody either blocked the outlets or changed the drainage path. Reed's face tightened. "Changed it how?" "Temporary work, covers, debris, new flashing, anything that turned a roof into a bathtub." Claire looked at Reed. "What work was done in May?" "Routine." That isn't an answer. Reed opened a maintenance app on his tablet. He scrolled. Northline sealed membrane splits around 2 drains. Recoated flashing. Replaced 1 damaged leader. Martin leaned closer. "Where are the photo closeouts?" "Attached." Reed tapped the file. 3 photographs appeared. Daniel looked once and handed the tablet back. "Those aren't from May." Reed laughed in disbelief. "How could you possibly know that?" Daniel pointed toward the picture. "The rooftop exhaust curb is bare galvanized steel. If you look through the 6th floor west window right now, that curb is painted black." Claire looked. Martin did too. On the real roof, barely visible through rain, the exhaust curb was black. Reed stopped smiling. Daniel continued. "Either someone stripped and repainted it after the inspection, or those photos are older." Claire took the tablet. The file date said May 18th. She zoomed in. "Can metadata be changed?" Martin answered carefully. "Yes." Claire looked at Reed. "Did you verify this work yourself?" Reed's defensive expression became something else. Embarrassment. "No. Northline has had the account 11 years. "So you approved an invoice?" "I approved a vendor we have used for 11 years. The difference sounded thin. Daniel understood it anyway. Trust was efficient until the day it became expensive. Claire ordered the ballroom evacuated. This time, she did not call the regional vice president first. She simply did it. Guests complained. A foundation executive demanded her name. A surgeon in a tuxedo told her the hotel would be hearing from his office. Claire bowed slightly and said, "I hope you call me from somewhere with a sound roof." Daniel heard that from the hallway. He almost respected her for it. At 12:52, the lightning moved far enough east for Martin and 2 maintenance workers to access the roof. Daniel wanted to go with them. Claire stopped him. "You don't work here." "No." "You don't have safety clearance with us." "No. And if you get hurt, I have another emergency." Daniel's jaw worked. He knew she was right. He hated that she was right. So he stayed below. Sometimes expertise meant knowing when not to make yourself the hero. The roof inspection took 9 minutes. 9 long minutes. At 1:01, Martin's voice came over the radio. "Claire, everyone heard the change in it. Go ahead, we have ponding." "Significant? How significant?" 3 to 4 inches at the center field. Primary drains have temporary mesh baskets packed with roof coating chips. Daniel closed his eyes. Claire looked at him. "Overflow scuppers?" Martin hesitated. "Covered from outside by new decorative facade panels." Claire stared. "Those panels were installed in June." "Yes." "Approved by whom?" Silence. Then Martin said, "Regional design." The entire shape of the problem changed. This was no longer a careless hotel manager and a wet roofer. It was a system. Decorative metal panels had been added to modernize the ballroom exterior before a tourism awards inspection. The drawings should have preserved the overflow openings. Somewhere between design approval and installation, they had been covered. At the same time, Northline Exterior had left debris protection around the primary drains after a coating job, then apparently reused old photos to close the work order. 2 small failures from 2 different directions. Together, they had trapped thousands of gallons of stormwater above a room full of people. "Can you clear the drains?" Claire asked. Working on it, Daniel looked toward the ceiling. "Don't stand beneath the long span area." Claire repeated that into the radio. At 1:06, a section of decorative plaster in the empty east side of the ballroom gave way. It fell onto 2 tables with a crash that echoed through the corridor. No one was inside. The room went silent anyway. Claire stared through the doors at broken plaster, overturned silverware, and water pouring through the opening. Her hands began to shake. She hid them by gripping the radio. Daniel saw. "You got them out." She looked at him. "Because you pushed." "No. Because you decided." That sentence stayed with her. By 1:25, the primary drains had been partially cleared. Water thundered through the leaders. The building settled. Fire officials arrived and closed the ballroom wing until daylight inspection. Guests were relocated into meeting rooms on lower floors. Hotel staff brought blankets. The lobby, which Claire had protected so fiercely from becoming a shelter, became one anyway. Not for strangers, for paying guests. The distinction looked smaller now. At 1:41, Helena Crow returned from speaking with fire officials. She had changed into dry clothes, but still carried Noah's red blanket. She found Daniel near the service corridor. "I understand you saved my ballroom." Daniel shook his head. "I heard a roof. Most people hear rain." "Most people aren't roofers," Helena smiled. "You say that like it's a small thing." "It is, if you're standing next to one." She studied him. "Claire tells me you noticed the photographs were old." "Probably old." "You don't like taking credit." "I don't like taking things I can't prove." Helena looked toward the ballroom. "That may be the first comforting sentence I've heard tonight." She offered him the blanket. Daniel took it. "Thank you." "No, thank your son." "I do, constantly." Helena leaned against the wall. "My husband died in a hotel fire 20 years ago," she said. "He went back for 2 employees. They lived." Daniel looked down. "My wife called me twice from an ambulance. I was working. I missed both." "Would answering have saved her?" "No." "Does knowing that help?" "No." Helena nodded. "Then grief has given us the same useless answer." They stood together without trying to repair what could not be repaired. At 2:10, Noah woke and came downstairs. The lobby was now full of displaced ballroom guests. He looked around. "Are they homeless?" Daniel frowned. "No. Their room got water in it." Daniel stared at him. Noah was not trying to be clever. That made it sharper. Claire heard from 10 feet away. She lowered her eyes. At 3:00 a.m., the regional vice president arrived. His name was Victor Hale. He entered through the revolving door in a charcoal raincoat and the expression of a man who believed any disaster could be reduced to the name of the person who had failed to prevent it. Claire met him near reception. He did not greet her. Tell me the ballroom was evacuated after a fire order, Claire said. Before... Victor stopped. On whose authority? Mine. He looked toward the broken ceiling area beyond the barricades. Based on what? Claire glanced at Daniel. Victor followed her eyes. Daniel was helping Noah build a pillow nest on a lobby sofa. Victor's face hardened. The contractor? No. Engineer? No. Claire said it clearly. A roofer? Victor almost laughed. Helena approached behind him. He did not see her. Claire continued. He saw the overflow failure before facilities confirmed it. Victor lowered his voice. Do you understand what an unscheduled evacuation of a donor event does to our liability position? Claire looked past him at Helena, then back. I understand what a ceiling collapse with 183 people under it would do. Victor's jaw tightened. This is exactly why we have reporting lines, Helena spoke. And this is exactly why buildings fall while people follow them. Victor turned, his face drained. Mrs. Crow? Good morning, Victor. He tried to recover. I was just establishing the sequence. So am I. Claire looked at Daniel. For the first time that night, authority in the room no longer flowed through job titles. It flowed toward the person who had been willing to notice. Victor asked for the maintenance records. The investigation began before sunrise. By 6, the storm had weakened. Daniel planned to leave. Helena stopped him at the door. Where will you go? Back to the apartment, see what survived. The city has inspectors restricting flood-damaged buildings. I know how roofs work. City inspectors know how liability works. Daniel gave her a tired look. She smiled. One more night, no charge. He started to refuse. Noah touched his hand. Daniel looked down. Pride or dignity? Again. One more night, he said. Helena nodded. Then she handed him a business card. Come to the ballroom inspection at 2. I'm not your employee. No. Then why? Because everyone who was paid to see the problem missed part of it. Daniel looked at the card. Helena's name appeared with no decorative title. Just Chair, Bellwether Property Trust. She said, I would like one person in the room who is more interested in the roof than the org chart. At 2 that afternoon, Daniel walked into a conference room wearing the only dry clothes he owned. Around the table sat engineers, insurers, attorneys, hotel executives, fire officials, and the Northline exterior account manager. $100,000 of suits. Daniel carried a $15 notebook. Victor Hale looked at him and said, I thought this was a technical review. Daniel pulled out a chair. So did I. The technical review lasted 12 minutes before it became something else. Northline's account manager, Peter Voss, began with slides. He said the May roof work had been completed according to scope. He said the drain baskets were temporary debris protection that should have been removed by hotel maintenance. He said the facade project had been managed by a different vendor. He used passive sentences carefully. Mistakes had been made. Conditions had been observed. Responsibilities had been shared. No person existed inside the grammar. Daniel listened. Claire sat across the table with a legal pad she had not written on. Victor sat beside 2 company attorneys. Helena sat at the far end. Peter advanced to a photograph of the roof taken after the May work. Daniel looked at it, then at the printed copy in front of him. Can you go back? Peter paused. To which slide? 14. The slide returned. Daniel stood but did not approach the screen. That photo is older than May 18th. Peter smiled with practiced patience. We've already discussed the exhaust curb paint. Not talking about the paint. The room quieted. Daniel pointed. Look at the northeast parapet. The expansion joint cover. An engineer leaned forward. Daniel continued. Your hotel records show that joint cover was replaced after the April windstorm. The new one has 3 exposed fasteners on the west plate because the substrate cracked. Martin Say opened a folder. He found the April repair sheet. 3 exposed fasteners. Daniel pointed at the photograph. The cover in your May closeout has 5. Peter stopped smiling. Daniel's voice stayed flat. So the picture isn't from May. It's from before April. The ventilation system hummed above them. One of the attorneys shifted in her chair. Peter said, That could be a file management error. Could be. Daniel turned a page. Then there is this. He had spent the morning reviewing maintenance documents Helena authorized him to see. Not because evidence had fallen into his hands, because a pattern bothered him. The primary drains had been left with mesh debris baskets. The overflow scuppers had been covered in June. Those errors came from separate vendors, but both projects used the same site supervisor sign-off, a digital signature belonging to Reed Mason. Reed sat 3 seats away, gray-faced. Daniel looked at him. "I don't think Reed signed these." Reed blinked. Victor leaned forward. "What are you suggesting?" Daniel placed 2 pages side by side. "I'm saying this signature was copied." Peter's voice hardened. "You're a roofer, not a forensic examiner." Daniel nodded. "Correct." Then he tapped the pages. "But I know pencils." Several people looked confused. Daniel continued. "Reed signs his first name with the R starting below the line. Every form he filled out by hand last night does it. These 2 digital approvals have identical pixel breaks on the meters and the same compression artifact near the date field." He looked at Martin. "You pulled the audit history?" Martin turned his laptop around. After he pointed it out, Claire felt the room change. Martin read from the screen. Both approvals were uploaded from a vendor portal account assigned to Northline Exterior. Peter's face lost color. "That portal is shared." Helena spoke for the first time. "Shared with whom?" Peter did not answer. One of the attorneys did. According to access logs, only Northline's account administrator and regional project liaison. Victor slowly looked toward the door. The regional project liaison was not in the room. He was on his way. His name was Colin Drexler. He worked for Bellwether Hospitality. He had been the executive sponsor of the facade modernization, and he reported directly to Victor Hale. Claire's stomach tightened. The problem was climbing the org chart. Daniel did not look pleased. He looked tired. The meeting recessed while security preserved access logs. 40 minutes later, Colin arrived. He denied everything. Then Martin produced the change order chain. The original facade drawings showed open overflow scuppers. A revised field instruction covered them behind decorative panels. The revision carried Colin's approval. Why? Because the exposed scuppers were considered visually inconsistent with the new exterior. The installer had warned him in an email. Colin replied that drainage had already been addressed under Northline maintenance. Northline, meanwhile, had reused old completion photographs to close the maintenance ticket without returning to remove debris baskets after coating repairs. Each side had assumed the other side had solved the water. Each side had produced documents that made the assumption look complete. Reed had approved invoices because he trusted long-standing vendors. Claire had trusted Reed because the hotel had passed internal audit. Victor had pressured properties to avoid emergency disruption because Bellwether's insurance premiums had risen after a series of weather claims. No one had woken up intending to put 183 people beneath trapped stormwater. That was the frightening part. Catastrophe did not always require a villain. Sometimes it required a chain of reasonable people protecting the wrong thing. The room went so quiet that the ventilation hum seemed mechanical and enormous. Victor looked at Daniel. "How did you know where to look?" Daniel closed his notebook. "I didn't," Victor frowned. "I knew the photos were wrong. I knew the water wasn't leaving. After that, you follow what doesn't fit." Peter Voss stared at the table. Claire watched Daniel and realized something that embarrassed her more than Helena's reprimand in the lobby. The night before, she had looked at his soaked jacket and assumed he needed something from her. A room, money, permission. She had never considered that, within an hour, the building itself would need something from him. Helena folded her hands. "Mr. Brooks, what do you charge for consulting?" Daniel almost laughed. "I don't consult. You did for 14 hours. I was trying to keep a ceiling off people." "What do you charge for that?" "Usually somebody pays my roofing invoice late." A few people smiled. Helena did not. "I am serious." Daniel looked at Noah, who sat in the back of the room with a coloring book Claire had found in the gift shop. He thought about $4.86. The truck brakes, the ruined apartment ceiling, Noah's shoes. For one moment, the money Helena could offer felt like a door opening. He wanted to walk through it. That frightened him because he knew how quickly desperation could become dependency. "I'll take payment for the hours," he said. "Fair rate, nothing else." Helena lifted an eyebrow. "Nothing?" Daniel hesitated. Then his gaze moved to Claire. "One thing." Claire straightened. He said, "When the city sends people here during the next storm, Don't make the lobby a test of who can pay. Victor started to speak. Helena raised a hand. Daniel continued. You don't have to become a shelter. You don't have to promise rooms you don't have. But dry floor, water, blankets, 10 minutes to make a call. Write it down so the next manager doesn't have to choose between compassion and getting fired. Claire looked at him. That was not the condition she expected. Helena looked at Victor. Can we do that? Victor's face showed the reflex to calculate cost. Then he looked at the photograph on the screen, the false closeout image that had nearly cost much more. Yes, he said. Helena nodded. Do it. Claire spoke quietly. And put my name on the pilot. Daniel looked at her. She met his eyes. I made the choice last night. I can help make the next one easier. No apology speech, no tears, just responsibility. Daniel respected that more. The consequences were specific. Northline lost Bellwether's regional maintenance contract pending investigation. Colin Drexler was terminated after the review confirmed he had ignored the drainage warning. Reed kept his job but lost invoice authority until retraining. Victor received a board reprimand for policies that discouraged local managers from acting under uncertainty. Claire remained general manager. Helena's reasoning was simple. Claire had failed morally in the lobby, then corrected course before the ballroom failed physically. Accountability did not require pretending people could never learn. 3 weeks later, the Bellwether Grand reopened its ballroom with every overflow scupper visible and functional. Daniel was paid a normal commercial rate to review the repair. He used the money to replace his truck brakes, move Noah out of the water-damaged apartment, and finally clear the last disputed hospital balance from Laura's final night. When the zero balance letter arrived, Daniel sat in the truck holding it for a long time. It did not end grief. It closed one drawer. That evening, Noah asked whether they were still between homes. Daniel answered, not anymore. Then he added something he had learned to say more often. I don't know if everything will always be fine. I know I won't leave you alone with it. Noah nodded. That's better. Daniel thought so too. Claire changed too. Bellwether adopted a severe weather policy allowing non-guests to remain in designated public areas during dangerous conditions, with water, charging, and basic blankets provided without payment. Local managers were given discretion to extend the time when travel was unsafe. Claire put her own name on the pilot. Months later, Noah's Science Club held an awards dinner in the rebuilt Bellwether Ballroom. Daniel wore a borrowed jacket. Noah wore the new sneakers Daniel had finally been able to buy. Before dinner, Helena returned the red blanket, washed and folded, the stitched white stars bright again. I needed it longer than I expected, she told Noah. Noah accepted that without asking why. Claire came over before the ceremony and looked toward the ceiling. The drains are clear, she told Daniel. He smiled. I wasn't going to ask. You were thinking it. Occupational problem. Noah took his father's hand and pulled him toward the tables before work could claim another minute. Daniel went. For once, nothing needed saving. Human worth is easy to praise after it becomes useful. The harder test comes before the proof, before the title, before anyone important walks through the door. It comes when a person has nothing visible to offer except wet clothes, tired eyes, a child holding his hand, and a request for 10 dry minutes. Status can tell you who owns the building. Money can tell you who reserved the room. Policy can tell you who is authorized to decide. But none of those things can tell you who deserves warmth. That has to be decided before the knock. And sometimes, the people who understand it in time do more than keep a door open. They keep the whole roof from falling in.